Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Greg. Joining me, Dr. Marks. We are going to be discussing prophecy that has been fulfilled. So, we get into those. Hebrews chapter 1 says, "In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets, and at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, He's spoken to us by His Son, whom He appointed heir of all things, and through whom He also made the universe." And so, that whole chapter is awesome, anyways, but, I find it fascinating that Jesus says in Luke chapter 13, He says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing." And He goes on just shortly after that to say, "If you would have known the time of thy visitation."
Yeah.
Well, what is He talking about? There's a prophecy that talks about when the Christ would come altogether too.
In the book of Daniel.
And because they weren't versed in those prophecies, they missed it. They misunderstood the prophecy, but it talks about the exact day that He would come, right?
Right to the day.
And it's fascinating how God's not winging it. He is in absolute 100% control. Just to briefly go over a couple other examples, Daniel chapter 2 talks about the main kingdoms of this world. Daniel 70 weeks, which talks about 70 weeks of years that are appointed to the Israelites. These are individual studies. If you guys aren't familiar with these, go through, Google them, look into them. This is awesome stuff. You see God. Again, He's not winging it. He is in absolute control. There's the prophecies of when the Messiah would come, as we just mentioned, and in Leviticus, the third book of the Bible, chapter 23, God appoints 7 feasts for the Israelites. And these 7 feasts, you read these and you're like, those are some interesting religious ceremonies that they are called to do. Well, the word used was moeds, right? These are dress rehearsals. And dress rehearsals, the Jews were celebrating these traditional feasts.
Yes.
Dress rehearsals are not the real deal.
No.
They're a practice, right? And so you see
they're pictures of what's coming.
Exactly.
These are time periods that are coming upon us.
Sure.
You mentioned Daniel chapter 2 and the prediction of the coming kingdoms. Well, there's simply no way that Daniel, writing in roughly the 5th century BC, could have known what was coming, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire. And yet it all fits, it all lines up. And we can prove that Daniel was written long before these events, and yet it's lined up. Well, what does it also tell us? And we got to be clear on this. You mentioned the 70 weeks. Well, I know we're going to do another whole video on what's coming in the future.
Sure.
But just as accurate as what has been fulfilled, because it's 100%, well, that's telling you this is what is coming in the future too, and we need to be prepared for it.
Sure. No, it's awesome stuff. I'm going to go through and before I read chapter 53 out of the book Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, right, which God delivered this message through him. In conclusion, the prophecy that's been fulfilled, it's all throughout the Old and also in the New Testament, correct? And the reason why prophecy is so important is because it's one of the main ways God proves He's God by miracles, supernatural things, by our existence today, the fact that it's literally a physical miracle for us to be here today, scientifically speaking. And number 3 is prophecy. He declares the end from the beginning before it even happens, showing that His nature is divine and He's outside of time, right?
I agree. And as he's reading this Isaiah chapter 53, keep in mind that this was written in somewhere between the early 7th and mid 8th century before Christ, which would have been hundreds of years before the Romans, hundreds of years before Roman crucifixion was invented. There's no way that he could have known these things. Furthermore, you will see, if you just think, as he's reading this, who does this sound like? What story does this sound like? Go ahead.
Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up like before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no stately form or majesty to attract us to him, no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. Like one whom men hid their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he took on our infirmities and considered our sorrows. Yet we considered him stricken by God, struck down and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each one has turned his own way. And the Lord, speaking of God the Father, has laid upon him, God the Son, the iniquity of us all. Yet he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before the shears is silent, and who can recount his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living. He was stricken for the transgressions of my people. This is Isaiah speaking. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with a rich man in his death. Although he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth, yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And when his soul is made a guilt offering, he will see his offspring, he will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After the anguish of his soul, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he has poured out his life unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. Mm-hmm. Again, this is 700 years before Christ, before Jesus even was on this earth.
Right.
Very detailed account.
Very. I mean, if you look closely in there, you see exactly what we see in the records of the life of Jesus. He was not, like a,
not deceitful or
right.
Not, yeah.
He was well known for his not being super beautiful or anything that everybody wanted to come and hear, but he was just a normal guy. But it talks very clearly about being pierced there. And this is the piercing of crucifixion. It talks about stripes, which is specifically the stripes of being beaten with a whip. That was very specific to Roman crucifixion. It talks clearly about he was dead, and assigned a grave with the wicked, buried with the rich. He was buried in a rich man's borrowed tomb. We know that from history. And then it says, once he made atonement, because that's what this is. Remember, we talked about in the other video that blood atonement is what this was all about. Blood payment.
He's fulfilling the contract.
He was fulfilling the contract. Then it says he prolonged his days. Well, how can you prolong your days if you're not alive? And then later it says, and he will see the light of life. In other words, it's showing, before they understood the concept of resurrection, that this is what Jesus was going to do. And because of his resurrection, he has been assigned a name with the greatest. It's the greatest name ever known, the greatest life in all of history, and yet he never wrote a book or led an army or held a political office, and yet we literally divide history based on his life.
Sure.
So it's all been fulfilled. Everything you see in Isaiah 53 has been fulfilled in the life of Jesus Christ, and that was written 700 years before he was born.
And to cap this off, as though that's not enough, Jesus specifically says, I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, or to complete it. And how fascinating that is. Yeah. Once again, you see that Jesus was not a knee-jerk reaction, just as the prophet Isaiah says, it was the Lord's will to crush him. God the Father, right?
This was the plan.
He knew it.
Yes.
This is his plan. He's not just winging it.
No, not at all.
God is in control.
He is indeed.